All right, everyone, welcome back to the Sensitive Podcast. I am your host, Kim Kimball, Somatic Leadership Coach for highly sensitive and neurodivergent business owners. And I have such a special episode today with Madison Morrigan. Today, we're going to be talking about autism, somatic healing, and full self expression. I've been looking forward to this episode for a really long time. Madison is a mentor of mine whose work has really impacted me and my work very, very deeply. So I can't wait to share more of their work with you here today. So I'm going to pause and allow Madison to introduce themselves, and then we can dive in.
Thank you. I feel so flattered and kind of giddy to be here. I feel my energy like starting to bubble up in a little effervescence. But yeah, I'm Madison. I do somatic work for trauma resolution, but the primary focus is on returning to blueprint or returning to something like wholeness. And that really shows up in helping people orient to what's well and how even symptoms are usually a sign of their body responding to a real thing, whether it's presently happening or happened in the past, that their body is trying to reconcile. And so, really looking for help first. And a lot of my clients end up being highly sensitive people, autistic, neurodivergent in some way, and have really not found a lot of support in traditional clinical models. And so a lot of people will find me and they're like, your work really resonates with me. I've tried all the coaching and all the therapy, and I'm the most self-aware person there's ever been, and no one can help me. And so saying all of that, that was my journey too, right? And so aside from that, I have a pug named Morris, and we live in the Ozarks, and I'm often traveling to Arkansas, and I live a pretty basic life aside from loving this work and just doing fun things with my dog and my girlfriend. So that's me.
Thank you so much for sharing. I love seeing Morris and the little bug eyes. So cute. I remember when you first got him, tiny, tiny little nugget, and I was like, oh,
He was only 3 pounds.
wow.
So you started this new thing yesterday where I guess I accidentally spilled his food the other day out of his slow feeder. And he realized it was much easier to eat when his food wasn't in the slow feeder. And now he won't eat unless I dump his food onto the floor. And so that's just where we're at in terms of like teenage pug energy. And so that's my life. I do somatic trauma resolution and I am like obedient to my dog, pretty much.
Shit. Oh man, I love it so much. It's like those, that's reminding me of my son that there are these little accidents that I do that like open up a doorway for him to do something a little bit differently. And then he's like, oh no, we're going all in on this direction now. And I'm like, oh gosh, what did I do? What did I do? Right. So,
Yes.
yeah, well, I was in one of your masterminds, Rising Sovereign, and neither you or I knew that either one of us were autistic at the time, which I know we were reminiscing about before we even hit record, which I just think it's so funny to look back on now. But I know I've had my own very tender journey of realizing and recognizing my own autism. And I know that like your journey is something that I've always been more curious to have a deeper conversation with you about than I've been able to have because I don't think we've really connected at this level in this way since both of us realizing that we are autistic.
Yeah.
So I would love to hear anything you want to share about your own experience of realizing that you're autistic and your experience really of being an autistic person in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is so interesting because I always had a hunch, right? Like that there was something as a little person, my mom always remarked that I was really particular. And I was in all the gifted programs, and my gifted teacher, the program was called Spectrum, okay? The gifted program was
Of
called
course it was.
Yeah. Yeah. And she would remind us, you all are high IQ, which was the label of what giftedness was at the time. But that doesn't mean you're not disabled. Like you're uniquely high IQ, and that makes you in some ways, a high risk population. And she was really sweet. Her name's Miss Andrews. We still keep in touch on Facebook, which is so sweet. And I knew that there was like something that was different. And I could, there were young signs, like in the fifth grade, during the gifted day, which was the day all the gifted students would leave class to go to the other classroom, my teacher would host a movie day because he didn't like that there was a gifted program. And I would start a petition about how that was rude and wrong, and everyone would sign it, and about how we should also be able to watch movies. And I remember him just pulling me in the hallway, like trying to make a scene so that no one followed my lead. And he's like, "Can you just stop this? Like, can you just stop?" So, like, looking back, that's the kind of child I was. I refused to wear jeans, only wore dresses, only went by Katie for a couple years, like, very particular, only ate cream cheese sandwiches for a couple years. Like, how much taller would I be if I had eaten something different than raw ramen noodles and cream cheese sandwiches? And my parents were just kind of like, yeah, Madison's different and she is gifted. And what they didn't see was that that often leads to asymmetrical development. So, like, being really gifted in some ways and then, like, really being behind. And they kind of chalked it up to that I started school when I was 4 because I tested in, and they're like, oh, you're just younger than your classmates. So there's like a little bit of a social disconnect. But looking back now, I see that that social disconnect was a lot more than just like being a year younger than the other kids. So I had been in therapy. I had a therapist who specialized in gifted children, but not adults, because rarely, now we know, does anyone specialize in gifted adults. It's like autistic children are only young boys, right? Like they grow up and they stop being autistic. I don't know. So fast forward early 2020, I host a retreat in Hawaii with a colleague, Hillary McBride and Vadia Aroshina, on spiritual trauma. And it was someone who came to the retreat who was autistic and not high masking. So they were exemplifying their autistic traits without shame, no desire to cover them up. And my body had such a large reaction to this person in the sense of like, I felt so seen and recognized by their unmasked expression in a way that like kind of scrambled me. I was like, okay, I'm gonna process this, that something's really the same about me as this person, but it wouldn't have been obvious on the outside because I'm so high masking. And so I went home, and a couple months later, I messaged that person. They ended up joining Awaken Her Soul, which was one of my programs, and I'm in dialogue with them. And I was like, I'm thinking that I could be autistic, and they give me a bunch of resources. I take the test, the online test they recommended, which I forget the name of now, but and it was like, yeah, you're autistic, and I was like, okay, I kind of just like was like, interesting. I'll revisit that another time. And I remember mentioning to my roommate at the time, like, I think I'm autistic. And she was like, no, no, no. Like, everything you're saying is like totally normal. So fast forward to 2022, she gets diagnosed as autistic by her therapist. And she comes to me and was like, so remember when I told you there's no way you were autistic because everything you were saying to me was normal? Well, it turns out I'm autistic and my normal is autism. So maybe you should reconsider. And so that kind of really just like led to a lot of self-acceptance. And I started talking to my not therapist, my coach about it and like looking into it more deeply. And I actually chose not to seek a clinical diagnosis because in some countries you can't move there if you have a clinical diagnosis. And one of my friends who got the doctor said, you are autistic. I'm not going to put it in your records, essentially. And she was just like, maybe you shouldn't. But then I started looking at my dad and his mom and my siblings who are related to my dad. And, it was a tricky thing because I'd spent so many years being like, oh, I have CPTSD. I'm really traumatized, thinking that all of these symptoms were trauma. And it turned out the more trauma and somatic work I did, the more obviously autistic I became. So it was like whenever I healed the coping mechanisms, I actually seemed a lot more autistic. And that really helped me see that my siblings who aren't autistic don't have the same dad as me, but they have the same trauma as me. And my siblings who are autistic didn't grow up in a house where I experienced the trauma, but are definitely autistic. And so that's kind of like the short version. Mind you, there was many, you know, lots of trepidation, sadness, grief, like the kind of like wave that hits you once you realize that like everything you've thought about yourself has a new context to live inside of. And so, yeah, there was a lot of like probably a year of just being like depressed, to be honest. And it was like, see, there is something wrong with me. Like the whole time I knew something was wrong with me. And the therapists who would be like, well, everyone thinks they're special and different. And like who would gaslight me telling them, like, no, so, like something is different. So I've come to terms with it now. I've talked to my doctor, my therapist, and my coaches about it. And I'm like, okay, this is true about me. And it's it's helped me in so many ways, but there's also been a lot of grief. And so I'll pause there because I know that's a lot.
Yeah. Well, first of all, just thank you for sharing so openly. I know that I've heard bits of this story just through listening to your own podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And there were parts of it that helped me so much on my own journey. So I know that people who are listening are going to likely be buoyed by listening to this as well. And I really hope by both of us sharing our own story with this, it can be helpful for folks as well. So I really appreciate you sharing. Um, there was so much that I resonated with about it. For me, I'll just share just so that there are more stories that hopefully people can relate to. Um, when I turned 3 years old, it was kind of like a light switch went off, according to my mom. Of course, I don't have many like actual explicit memories from this period of time, but she said that at that point in time, it was like everything all of a sudden became it needed to be just so. Like the tag in my underwear needed to be just so. My shoes needed to be tied just so. I would go to the bathroom and I would use an entire roll of toilet paper because I would insist that I wasn't dry. Just things like this that would take up an inordinate amount of time. And my mom, quite frankly, just didn't know what to do with because she had never encountered anything like that. And I would have massive meltdowns about it. And so, anyway, all of this went on until I would say I was like 9 years old, 8 or 9 years old. My mom kind of sat me down and said, "You're going to a psychologist and you need to get some help. And what is happening isn't normal." At least that's the way I internalized the message was something is wrong with you. This isn't normal. We need to take you to someone who is going to fix you because this is not normal what's happening with you. And I just remember having such a visceral response to that of like internalizing my family thinks something is wrong with me. My family thinks I'm broken. My family is sending me to someone to fix me. And then what happened is kind of the stereotypical thing that happens with autistic women and girls. And that is that I was diagnosed with OCD. But there was never any they would always kind of make these justifications of, well, she doesn't have compulsions, she just has obsessions, about the things that I needed to have just so. And I'm like, now as an adult, I'm like, that doesn't make any effing sense. Like there's no sense to that of like, oh, I don't have compulsions, I just have the obsessions. They were trying to make it fit and like trying to understand me in some way, right? And what ended up happening from there is they medicated me. So I ended up being medicated from the time I don't know, I was either 9 or 11 years old to the time that I took myself off of my medication when I was 23, I believe. So it was for a very long time that I was medicated. And there was this understanding of like, well, you just need this medication in order to cope in the world. And I look back at it now, and it's because I have such difficulty with sensory processing that this medication was supposed to help take the edge off of all of my sensory processing difficulties, which were extremely challenging for me, which nobody named for me, right? Like this is what actually was. Right, this is what is happening. And they put me through the absolute hell and torment of gosh, I'm spacing on what the name of it is, exposure therapy. So they would take my triggers, my absolute worst sensory triggers, and expose me to listening to them again and again.
Oh, it makes me so mad.
Yes. And so this was supposed to quote unquote cure me, right? Yeah. And then I felt broken because it didn't make it better. I'm like, I'm being exposed to this. I'm literally every cell in my body is crawling and I feel like I want to crawl out of my skin and vomit being exposed to this. Like it's for anybody that has never experienced this level of sensory overwhelm through sensory processing difficulties, It feels like
Mm-hmm.
every nerve fiber in your body is on fire. Like you cannot
Yeah.
escape it. And so I was getting exposed to this over and over again, and it never got any
Mm-hmm.
better. And so by the time that and my journey was quite similar to yours of like trying all the therapies, doing all the things, nothing quote unquote helps, right? I got my own somatic therapist who I'm still with and I've been with for, gosh, I guess it's like 7 years now. And I had a friend of mine who got diagnosed with autism, and she was like, I can totally see you as being autistic. And I took such great offense to that when she told
Mm-hmm.
me that. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And it was because of the narrow view and understanding of that I had of autism at the time, right? But I was
Yes.
like, no, that's not me. I don't have these relationship challenges, and I don't have difficulty in XYZ ways, my narrow understanding. And then as I started to research it more, and I was like, actually, this resonates a lot. Like this
Yeah.
really feels very true for me. And so I started to bring it to my somatic therapist, and we started to talk about it, unpack it. And eventually both of us landed. And I really appreciate you sharing this part of your journey of saying, I didn't pursue an official diagnosis and the reasons that you did it, because I think that's really important to validate people not doing that and having really valid
Mm-hmm.
reasons for not doing that, especially there are some very even now valid reasons right now. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but same thing for me. I never have pursued an official diagnosis. And even my therapist looked at me. She was like, why do you need to spend thousands of dollars for somebody to tell you something that you already know about yourself?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I don't need that label for on my record and on my health record that could potentially limit me in such a way or put me, quite frankly, in an unsafe situation um, in the future. So I think it's really important to validate our own knowing about ourselves
Yeah.
and to mention a name. You said there's a lot of grief in this realization and there's a lot of freedom. And I want to say that for myself as well, is that um, there was a lot of grief for me, and there's a lot of things that I don't know. We've had this conversation very briefly in the past of like, I feel like I've been able to come to a level of acceptance of things about myself that I couldn't accept before, that I was always trying
Yeah.
to change. It's like, I
Mm-hmm.
cannot change how my brain is wired. I cannot change the fact that I'm autistic. And at this point, right, nor would I want to. And so, really being
Yeah.
able to come to this place of accepting instead of
Yeah.
being in this adversarial relationship with myself has been so important.
Yes. And I thank you for sharing all of that. I hate that you went through that, and it's also so common for those of us who are autistic to have gone through a lifetime of people telling you that you're broken and that you're wrong and trying to fix you by many different means. And I also just want to validate those. Like I have multiple clients myself who we've explored this and they're like, it's really important for me to get a formal diagnosis to know, to feel validated by
Yeah.
that. And every one of them that has pursued a diagnosis has gotten a diagnosis. And so it really affirmed for me also watching so many people we explore it. I'm like, I really think this feels really relevant. Every single one of them who got a formal diagnosis or who went to did. And so it really does show that like they do say that most people who self-diagnose are autistic. And for some people, it's really important to get a formal diagnosis, although there are no accommodations that come with a formal diagnosis. Like it's not like you get support on the other side of that, other than the support you give yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate you naming that as well. And I want to shift it to talking about shame alchemy. And I think that's so relevant even to the conversation that we've already
Yeah.
had, right? It's so obvious that for neurocomplex people, shame alchemy is something that is likely very, very needed. And I know you have a unique take on that I would love to hear. So, what is shame from a neuroscience standpoint? And how can we learn to support ourselves through it? And why is that important in the way that we show up in the world?
Yeah, well, I want to start off like you said three things about your experience. Not normal, something is wrong with me, I need to be fixed. And that all of those came as a result of other people's experience with you. That was not intrinsic. And it didn't sound like that was something that you were experiencing. Oh, this is wrong about me. And so when we're born, we have 7 affective neural circuits, none of which are shame. So mind you, like we share this with all other mammals, even fruit flies have these neural circuits. Play, seeking, lust, like grief and panic, the core emotions, if you will. Shame's not one of them. Shame comes later because shame is a social emotion and it's learned through others' reactions to us. And so shame is effectively what happens when we either believe we've done something bad and like the community, the tribe, the village shames us so that we realize that something's wrong with our behavior. Or even more specifically than that, we can think of it like a response that I need to isolate because I'm sick and I'm going to get others sick. And so I say I have a shame alchemy workshop, and I say, if anyone here experienced shame when you got COVID, like, oh, I did something wrong. Who did I infect? Oh my God. We isolated. That is shame's purpose. Let me not infect anyone else. That will save the whole village. That's beautiful. And behaviorally, we can think of it like it's whenever other people project that disgust of like, that's dirty, that's bad, that's wrong, so that we either move away or change something about what we're doing. Again, effective in modifying behavior, effective in keeping illness away from the community. Not so effective if nothing's wrong with you and actually you're not doing anything wrong. And so it's really tricky for those of us who are neurocomplex because people don't understand what's actually happening, right? Like you're having a sensory issue and they're saying, oh, she's just obsessed. And so we need to fix this obsession. Well, then the need is actually not being met. Other people's disgust and issue with you is being projected onto you. And then that's becoming internalized of like, I either need to pretend to not have this reaction, which then you're just freezing it under the surface. And then on top of that threat response, in that case being freeze, it's a shame layer. And so now you have all of this threat response energy coated on top with shame. And it actually keeps all of that energy in the body. And so Irene Lyon, who's a wonderful somatic practitioner, she says, shame is the internalization that I am bad meat. And so it's that internalized. It's different than having like a wave of shame because you hurt your best friend's feelings. It's a totally different thing than remorse or guilt, but like I am bad at the core. My cells believe something is wrong with me. That's toxic shame. And so shame alchemy and all the work really I do is alchemy. It's taking something like lead. It's taking something that's gross and dense and stuck and turning it to something like gold. And so through somatic work, you're really familiar with somatic work. We learn how to work with energies like shame, like disgust, like aggression, and then all the threat responses, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And we learn to ride the waves of those experiences so that they become something more like vitality. So alchemy is essentially learning to be with the yuck in the pot until it becomes something else. And it will, whenever the right conditions are created. So I hope that was linear enough to make sense.
It makes so much sense to me, and I think even just naming it for what it is and naming the response can be so helpful for folks to listen to. Because sometimes when we don't have an understanding of the concept even, it can make our experience feel very foreign. And then that itself can induce shame, right? Of whatever experience it is that I'm having, this has to be bad and wrong within itself. Instead of what I'm hearing from you is this normalization of shame as part of the human experience, and that it's something that all of us experience, and that it's especially prominent even just in the stories that Madison and I shared for neurocomplex folks. It's way more prominent, right? And so even just normalizing that, and the fact that this is to me, this is the gold, if you would, of somatic work, is that it's normalizing these very normal human experiences, and it's letting you know, like, hey, under the right conditions, this doesn't have to stay stuck here. It
Yeah.
just gets to move through and it will
Yeah.
transform into something else. We don't have to pathologize and sit here and say, "Oh my gosh, I have this shame and I'm going to be stuck here forever and I'm never going to be able to fully
Hmm.
express myself and there's no way for me to get this to move through or to alchemize into something different." So that's
Yeah.
what I hear in what you're sharing. Does that feel true?
Yeah. Well, like the foundation of the work that I do, it's really that like every symptom, we can call it symptom, everything that we think is wrong and need to fix is a correct, healthy response given the issue, right? Given whatever's going on, like your response is it's like, oh, don't behave like this. The behavior of having meltdowns or needing everything to be just so was a healthy response to a deep sensory overwhelm. That was the correct response of your body trying to manage the conditions and create conditions so your body could be safe and comfortable. And so when we start to see like, oh, what's really going on, what's the real need here, then we can start creating conditions where those symptoms don't have to show up in the same way. And I've heard it said from people, there's a woman, and I wish I could remember her name, that I follow, and she's like, she talks about how she views herself as one of the few non-traumatized autistic people because her parents were very supportive of who she was. She got diagnosed very early, which is really uncommon because she's also a Black woman. So for a Black woman who's a young adult now to be have been diagnosed early is also like a miracle because we know Black folks and women are rarely diagnosed as children. And she was raised in an environment that supported and created conditions for her thriving. And it really got me thinking of like, do we even know what a non-traumatized autistic body is? And are a lot of the symptoms that we see in autistic bodies actually the signs that they're not in the right conditions for their neurocomplexity? And what if, like, what could be possible if the conditions were right for us to thrive? That interests me way more than like how to change our behavior, you know? Like, what if we got to thrive?
Absolutely. I had a therapist actually pose that question to me recently, and she was kind of looking at my sensory profile and my son's sensory profile and the interaction of the two,
Mm.
which was
Your
so
sons.
yeah, which was so
Okay.
incredibly fascinating, right? Of like, this is my son's, this is mine, and then these are like, this is the reason why this feels really crunchy in certain situations because his sensory needs and mine are
Mhm.
mismatched in some ways, right? And I'm his
Totally.
primary caregiver, and some of the ways that he soothes himself are profoundly triggering to me and my sensory
Hmm.
system. And she really posed the question to me. She was like, what I'm really interested in is us figuring out ways to meet both of your sensory needs so that you're not just in survival, but that you both get to thrive. And I remember leaving that appointment nearly crying in tears because I was like,
Yeah.
nobody has even ever said that to me. Like, that
Yeah.
hasn't even been a concept or thought in my mind that that would be possible. Right?
Right. Well, especially if it sounds like your early programming was like, how do I need to change so that everyone around me is comfortable because my responses are wrong? And like those things really just get in there. They really, really do. And I'm so glad you said that because I have multiple clients and people in my life who are autistic with autistic children. And I don't have children and it can be a struggle. And so I can only imagine the layers of difficulty of managing sensory stuff with a little body trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I think this transitions really well to talk about. I would love to hear just like riff, whatever you want to share. Like, what is it, something about somatic healing in the online space that drives you nuts and that you want to set straight
Oh
in
my
this moment?
God. I talk with my teachers a lot. Like so I have kind of two different veins of somatic work that I'm involved in, one being trauma resolution, which is not the end all be all of somatic work. And then yoga is like the other side of the somatic work that I practice. And my yoga teachers are like, everyone's like somatic this, somatic that, as if like the yogis haven't been doing body work. Like soma just means the body. So I think everything now, like somatic is a buzzword, and like I do use it because people are able to recognize it now. But like these modalities in many ways have been around for a long time, often in indigenous practices by non-white people. And that like rarely gets mentioned. And everyone's like talking about how they're doing somatic work, but they don't actually know the origins of where any of it comes from. And I think that's important to name because it's pretty common for, educated white folks to think they invented something that in fact indigenous people have been practicing for millions of years, probably. I'm saying millions, but I mean somatic is our first language. The body is the first language. And so if we look back at the most ancient civilizations, they were dancing, they were drumming, they were moving their bodies in ritual and ceremony. And being someone who practices in a shamanic tradition, I know in the Peruvian shaman lineage, they've been practicing energetic and somatic work without calling it that and still are. And so there's a piece of this for me where I'm like, oh, like so much of this doesn't have to be clinical at all. Like, are we in rhythm with nature? Do we know that our bodies are nature? We could literally do a fire ceremony. Like that's somatic work. These rituals are somatic work. They're body based, they're elemental. And so I like to encourage people to not think about somatic work like, and now I'm in a clinical setting where we're doing somatic work. Like you have a body the whole time you're alive. Like all of it can be somatic work. Like eating a meal gets to be somatic work if we think about paying attention. And so that's really what I think about like my yogic lineage and the Peruvian shamanism is so much of it is about right relationship to the body and right relationship to the natural world. And I do find that people who end up doing somatic work through a clinical setting end up there anyway, because the body just naturally guides us to those practices, because that's our true nature. Um, the other piece being that it's all about being regulated. I just like biohacking is not the same thing as doing somatic work. And I think sometimes the wellness industry is deeply unwell. Sometimes, I mean, like a lot of the time, the things I have seen online, and even in people that I know who get really into it, the new wellness thing, there's so much like overriding of what the body is actually saying to achieve a certain state, as if like forcing the body into like regulation is actually healthy. And I understand like the need to train the body for specific goals. Like that makes sense to me. But a lot of people are teaching regulating and being regulated as the goal of somatic work. Whereas in my opinion, like being in a right relationship to reality is what somatic work is for. And so if I'm calm and I need to be being angry and setting a boundary, then like I'm having a dissonant response to reality. And so in my practice, we don't use regulated or dysregulated. We use resonant or dissonant. And like I like to think, am I having a resonant response to what is happening? And sometimes I think visually, to use an autism word, I have hyperphantasia. And so everything is like sometimes more real in my mind. And so forgive me as I'm trying to figure out how to say this, but like I'm like, okay, over here on the left side of my brain, it's like, and now I need to pause because I'm like, how do I say this?
Take your time.
Yeah. So I'm losing it. Regulated, dysregulated, dissonant, resonant. I forget. Now I forget. It's so visual. And so I'm like, how do I say it? I lost it. Resonant and dissonant. I don't know. It's gone.
Yeah.
This is what happens.
Okay. It happens to me too. I totally understand. And I love that you are shifting away from and don't use, regulated, dysregulated. It's more, is this a resonant response or a dissonant response?
Yeah.
And the fact that you say, okay, like I am profoundly dysregulated if I should be angry based on what's going on and I'm calm. Like calm
Yes.
doesn't mean that I'm regulated, right? Quote unquote regulated. I know I'm just using that language for the sake of the language that is out there. Yeah, I remember that there was an experience that I had where I was sharing something in therapy that had happened to me, and I was sharing it very calmly, and I had my therapist kind of cock her head sideways and look at me, and she was like, "Weren't you angry about that? Like, aren't you angry about that?" And it took me so off guard because I was like, "No, why would I be angry?" And then I literally had to think about that for years. I still think about it. Obviously, that was probably 15 years ago. I had zero access to healthy anger at that point in my life. Like, to the extent where someone else had to reflect to me, like, are you not angry? Should you be angry at this point? Should you be angry at this? There was no access to healthy anger for me. And that was profoundly dysregulated, folks. But in the face of, this pop somatics, it would look like I had achieved quote unquote regulation, right?
Yeah.
So it's so important to talk about that.
You're helping me like put together what was happening in my brain because and still I drew the picture out while you were talking because it really helped me. Like what you were saying was you were having a historically resonant response. Like in your experience, and I'm so grateful you gave this example. Not feeling anger was the correct response to a previous thing. So there's something historical about that. And so you're bringing history into the present moment. And so it was resonant in the past because that's what was appropriate for survival, likely. That was the most appropriate response, is to not feel angry and just be calm. But in the present moment, that's a dissonant response because it's not in contact with reality. And so I say dissonant too, because it's like if we say it's a dysregulated response, that implies that something's wrong with it. Because in your history, that was the correct response to reality based on your body's survival strategies. But in the present, it actually doesn't meet the present moment like the present moment is happening. And so I think the work we do is not to say, oh, you should be more regulated or calm, or even you should have been angry, but like your therapist was doing, like, let's talk about like why isn't there anger here? Because anger would have been an even more resonant response based on this moment. And a lot of what we do in somatic work is we have to look at why are our bodies still responding like the past is what's happening. Because like regulation, in that case, you could have looked regulated, but your body wasn't in alignment with the reality. It was in alignment with the past. And so and I feel this is why I got like confused in myself, because I'm like, and that also was true, right? That was a resonant response based on reality, but not the present time reality. And so it's like, how do we catch the body up to present time? So then you can be like, and I am fucking angry because that was fucked up. And then that wave moves through. And the key is that we're not looping. Like, I wish I had I'm gonna draw this. I don't know. Is this gonna be on video?
Yes, it will.
Okay, great. And so I'm gonna draw like a little wave. And so, can you see this?
Yeah, I can.
And so, like, the anger that you felt could have gone up and peaked and then gone down. And you're like, oh, all of that wave is resonant because I'm having a healthy response to reality. But what happens is, like, let's just say there was that anger activation and it loops there forever, but it looped with a freeze. And it's like, oh, maybe there's anger on the surface, but I can't feel anything at all. Or like, oh, I got anxious about something and I never stopped being anxious. I didn't ride it up and bring it down. And so when we're looping, it's like we're living in past crisis. So we're not having a resonant response to reality. We're having a resonant response to something that's not happening anymore. Yeah. And so I need the visuals. Does that make sense to you?
It makes total sense. And it so tracks with the example that I just gave and the experience that I had, because it was exactly that. It was looping and freeze of, I can feel nothing at all. What are you talking about? Yeah. I stayed in functional freeze for a very long time, right?
And of course you did, because given your experience, you were exposed to all of your triggers. Yeah. It's like, what is your choice? Keep freaking out or feel nothing? Feel nothing is a way safer response.
Yeah.
And so in that way, I'm like, oh, that makes sense. And that's healthy, even though anger would probably have better suited you in that moment.
Absolutely.
So thank you for walking me through your experience, because it helped me recatch my visual and not get kind of caught up in taking me somewhere other than the present moment, because that is so easy to happen to me, where I'm like, I follow the trail of my own thoughts, and now I'm like, I have gone to 10 different places. Where am I?
I'm really glad that it was helpful because I think the combination between your visual and explaining and my example is really going to help some people with that.
I
So,
hope
thank
so.
you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, something I particularly adore about your work that I think is so unique to you is that you make it so profoundly simple. And I think it's so often in healing spaces, at least my experience, is that we make it very overly complicated, very complex, kind of like what you were saying earlier of like, this doesn't have to be clinical. I got chills in my body when you said
Yeah.
that. So, you weave healing into expressing yourself in the way that you dress and the way you move and the way you decorate your home, the way you sip your morning tea. And I feel that
Mm.
all so deeply from you. In short, it's just living, right? Healing can be just living. It can really be that
Yeah.
simple because isn't that the whole point? Isn't living the whole point? And I feel like we can all get so caught up in our healing that we actually forget to live,
Yeah.
especially for those of us who have had like for example, I know you mentioned CPTSD. I also have that. You can get stuck in this space of like, I gotta fix everything, I gotta work everything out. Uh,
Yes.
so I'd just love to have you expand on that a little bit, making it simple and actually just being the way that you live.
Yeah, I'm grateful you think it is simple because nothing about my brain feels simple at all. As you saw, I like overcomplicate things in my own mind. And I'm glad that things on the other side of the screen and in my work come off very simple because I think I spend a lot of time thinking about things and writing them through in a way that allows me to synthesize what is happening for me. I don't feel simple at all. I like at all, at all. And so I think I work with a lot of people who are neurocomplex. And if you haven't read the book Rainforest Mind, I highly recommend it. Not all autistic people are rainforest mind people, and not all rainforest mind people are autistic, although they're often neurodivergent in some way. But it's like the way of the brain that is like the hyper connected, extremely complex, kind of like Russian nesting doll brain. That's how I describe my brain is like one door opens to another door, opens to another door, and suddenly I'm like overwhelmed with thought. And so for me, the simplicity is honestly by necessity because I can very easily live in an existential crisis, very easily live in like overwhelming myself and also being hyperverbal, having to like talk it all through, talk it all through, talk it all through. And so kind of taking all of the information that I've ever learned about healing and somatics and shamanism and yoga, like I'm like, I have to look at what are the through lines of all of those threads. And so really I have to hit a point of like absolute overwhelm of information. And then finally I can find the simplicity in it, which is very autistic of me. And I have found that like a lot of it is just really living in harmony with what's happening. And it really is that simple. And sometimes I wonder, like, because I have a habit of just really caring what people think of, like, oh, I don't have like, my work isn't very proper. It's not clinical, and people take that shit seriously. But I find that like a lot of people feel further shamed by that style of healing. And it can be very interesting. And for those of us who love to learn, it like, can be really helpful in those aspects, but it can also become sterile and it can feel pathologizing and it can feel like an endless thing to be like achieving. And when I realized and learned that healing happens naturally when the conditions are correct for it, just like when the soil has the right nutrients and sun and water, the plant will grow. Like that makes sense. And that really is what all of the traditions teach is when the conditions are right, you either don't get traumatized or what's traumatized comes back into resonance and back into something like health. So, yeah, I think people just learn better. I recently accidentally had a video go viral about fart energy and I saw that one. It's cracking me up because I really didn't mean for it to like be so resonant. I thought it was funny and it essentially was saying like I was speaking to shame of like when you are chronically gaslit, you are internalizing other people's disgust, but those words can be so triggering. So I was like, it's their fart energy and they're pretending they didn't fart. And like, they're saying you farted and like, you're not the one who farted. Just move away from their fart. Like, it becomes so simple. And the amount of people who've commented and been like, I'm going to teach this to my kids. I'm going to teach this to my teenagers. I'm like, we really have to be speaking about these things like they're to children because the parts of us that are wounded are the child parts. And so when we're presenting our inner 5-year-old or the one inside of us who's pre-verbal, all this clinical information, they're like, okay, that means nothing to me. Or great, another thing you're calling me. That's a mean name that you're calling me. And rather than like, you're interesting and you have a lot of muchness. I love that word muchness. Like that makes so much more sense than like you're autistic and here's all these things happening in your brain. Like I like that information too, but my inner child prefers to hear that she's got a lot of muchness and just needs to have her house just so that she can dance around in it. Like that's way more fun. You know what I mean? Um, yeah, plus I think anything that can be made simple is like way more intelligent. So I'm just riffing now because I'm like I'm piecing together as a verbal, hyperverbal visual processor. I'm just like pulling at all these threads, like, oh my goodness, I'm so grateful it lands that way because nothing in my brain feels simple at all.
Well, you know what this is bringing up for me? This is really funny. I had a friend of mine message me that I returned the message right before we got on this podcast, and she was asking me to answer my own rapid fire questions that I have at the end because she was just really curious, like, what would your answer be to this?
Yeah.
And I don't want to give too much away because you got to answer the rapid fire questions, but she was asking, you know, like what my own experiences of being a highly sensitive and neurodivergent person in the world. And I was sharing how I wish people knew that their experience of me is so different from my own internal experience, right? And so that is highlighting this here of like, my experience is just the end product of you have found the through lines. You have found the pieces that are resonant in all of these different modalities and you have simplified them and you have distilled it down, and it's been, I know, at least a decade, probably if not more now, of doing this work where you have, but we haven't seen all of the complex thinking that's gone into that too. Right. But I think it's really important as part of the neurodivergent experience to name that.
Yes. Yeah, you're so right. You're so right. You know, my business also was the first place I could go to both be myself fully on the internet because it felt like safe to be able to express some of my autistic parts there. I didn't know that's what they were at the time, but also it felt like in my writing, I could finally express what I was really trying to say because sometimes I feel like my practitioners must be like, oh my God, she's so chaotic. And then see my stuff being like so put together because it takes kind of going into that chaos for me to then find all of the pieces. And I feel really grateful for the people in my life who are able to hold space for that kind of complexity because I know it is too much for some people. It can be too much for me sometimes. And I used to really feel like that was a shameful thing, but I have people and practitioners who know how to hold space for me to go to the vastness and the edges of everything and question every nook and cranny and then come back with a piece of like gold that I want to share. But you're so right. I think even autistic people who don't have like that kind of an inner world report feeling like what people reflect back to them is nothing like their experience of themselves. And I think we often, like, I feel chronically misunderstood. I hear that from like everyone in the community.
That was precisely what I said. I was like, I feel chronically misunderstood because people aren't seeing my internal experience, you know?
Yeah. Would you mind if I ask, like, this? I don't want to like totally reverse the roles, but I'm genuinely curious of like, how do you perceive yourself versus how you think other people perceive you?
Yeah, I have a lot of internal anxiety pretty much all the time. and people perceive me as an extremely calm person.
You
Like
do come
most
calm.
most everyone, even just being in my presence, always tells me what like a grounding, calm presence I have. And I think part of it is because there is so much chaos inside me that I've had to learn to hold it. And so I hold it for myself and I hold it for others. And there can be so much going on inside me. And I am still just kind of this very rooted, grounded presence in the midst of all of that. But that doesn't mean like the way that I feel internally inside me all the time is the way that I can describe the energy is like there's a live wire going on in my insides. Like that's what it feels like. And so for people to mirror and reflect to me, oh, you're so calm, you're so grounded. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, you do have. You're a Taurus though, right?
I am an Aries.
You're an Aries. Okay. Maybe I just saw Aries and Taurus next to each other. So maybe I saw your birthday and registered as Taurus. Okay, Aries is not. I would not say grounded.
Yeah. I have a lot of fire in my chart. So it's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah. Thanks for asking.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to pull a related thread in that I think for a long time in our healing work, at least for me, I can only speak for myself, that we tend to focus on keeping the bad out, like keep the bad out and hyper focus on the things we need to fix, as we've already named a lot. And I see you flipping that on its head, and your work really focuses on orienting towards the good. That's a large part of your work. So I would love for you to tell me a little bit more about that and maybe give some tangible examples of what that looks like in your life.
Yeah, I spent so many years with with both trauma and having like a hyperfixation on all the healing things, trying to understand. I spent a lot of years focused on researching and like all of my spare time. Everything was about mental illnesses. Everything was about narcissistic abuse. Everything was understanding why would people do that? Why are people the way that they are? And it came from both being autistic and just really not understanding the way people work and just being repeatedly in situations where I was taken advantage of or I was bullied and didn't realize until after the fact, where I had been perpetually in dynamics that were very harmful to me, but like could not see it in the moment. And that was true of my childhood. And then also being autistic, it like definitely makes you vulnerable to those kinds of dynamics. And so I think a vigilance came online of like, if I don't figure this out, I'm not going to be safe from this because I'm lacking some social intuition and like really just like seeing everyone as really good. And I think that that's, my girlfriend has reflected to me that she's like, I think people feel really safe telling you anything because you have almost no reaction to anything anyone is saying. So they think they can say the meanest shit to you, like you won't figure it out or something. So in my client work, it's wonderful because like people are able to be fully who they are. And I'm like not personally impacted. I like am able to be separate from it and witness their highest self in the midst of what they're saying. But in my everyday life, it's like, oh, there have been not kind people that I've let into my home and let into my life who did not have good intentions. And I just kept seeing their highest self and explaining away. And so whenever I realized that that's what I had been up to, I felt really unsafe. And I felt like my body had been betraying me because I was like, how am I supposed to keep myself safe if I don't hyper focus on spotting the dangerous thing? And it was probably like 3.5 years ago. It was on my 30th birthday, so almost 4 years ago. I joined my friend Mariana Rittenhouse's tea practice. And it was a course. It was like 60 days of just sitting in tea ceremony. And it introduced me to tea ceremony. And through that meditation time, I really realized how little I had focused on just being well. So it was like the first time I had created containment where I was like, this practice is not for journaling to find the pattern or researching anything. I'm just thanking the tea and orienting to the water in the bowl and my own heart. And through that course, the phrase guardian of the good just like kept speaking to me. And I was like, okay, what does that mean? And again, I had to go through all the rabbit trails, but in simplicity, it was like, I'm actually good. Like, I'm not defective. I'm not bad. and I'm the guardian of that, which means like instead of focusing outward on everything that's dangerous and being vigilant, I can focus on protecting the good thing. And then through more studies and curiosities, came to find out that the original mother wound is not being nurtured and not being protected. That those are the two things from a really healthy early life that we experience as nurturance and protection. And so Guardian of the Good was essentially this first layer of like rehabilitating what was not nurtured and protected in myself that would have made me know I was good at heart. And so the whole idea is essentially, and I've kind of built it out of like, you have this sacred garden of your life, and it has many layers of access to you. And there are some people who they might need to go through a maze with lots of different stop points before they ever get to the gates of your garden. And then it goes all the way to sacred and secret at the very middle, which is maybe you and God or you and yourself or whatever that is for you. And on the inside of that, it's like my home is kind of this representation of like, how many spaces can I nurture? I'm a Virgo, so maybe it's really my Virgo nature of like wanting to tend to things. Like, how can you, as the metaphor, like tending to your life to create the conditions for more goodness to happen and no longer focusing on really what I realize, what I can't understand. I don't understand it because I can't understand it. Like, I can't understand harming someone in those ways because I wouldn't. And when I realized that, like, it's never going to make sense to me. Some of the evil in this world is never going to make sense to me, no matter how much I study it, no matter how much I understand the brains of those people. And it also hasn't protected me all that much. It's just made me feel actually insane. And so, yeah. And then what's coming up is like I had a session with my practitioner, my shamanic practitioner. Her name's Karen. She's the sweetest 80-year-old woman. She was a therapist her whole life, and then also a shamanic healer of 30 years. And she's a 6 on the Enneagram. And so she's very concerned about protection and safety. And she was like,
Same.
like, yeah. And she's like, I just feel like you need a protector. Like you need protection. She kept, and so we did this shamanic journey to find a protector. And she's like, what's showing up for you? And I'm like, yeah, there's a jaguar protector, but she's laying down. She's like really not worried. She's really unbothered. And I just kind of come to terms with like, there are always going to be people who have weird motivations. And I really don't want to focus on them. Like, I want to focus on nurturing what's good for me. And like, I don't like to believe everyone has bad motives. It doesn't feel good to believe that. It doesn't feel good to be on guard. And so it's like kind of rehabilitating my discernment of seeing that people have patterns and not making excuses for it and having good boundaries, but not living in chronic vigilance. This is like the longest way to tell that story ever. So yeah, it's like, how can I nurture what's good and not be incessantly focusing on everything that's bad, and also not pretending it's not happening? Because there's that tendency to be Pollyanna if we're not careful.
Yeah. I love this response. And for whatever reason, the thing that came up for me while you were sharing that felt resonant for me to share is actually something that came from our time of when you were one-on-one coaching me during Rising Sovereign.
Mm-hmm.
I remember this question that you asked me one time, and I don't even quite remember the context, but obviously the question has stayed with me, where you asked me, you were like, Kim, what all these things that you're describing to me, that's you living against, like you're living from a place of being against this thing.
Like guarding
But
against.
yeah, but like what would it be like to live for and like towards the things that you're for? And it feels kind of a similar thing that we're talking about here. And I was able to recognize through that question that you asked me then, I was like, oh man, everything that I'm doing is really in this antagonistic response to what I'm against and what I'm trying to protect myself from. And I have very little energy actually flowing towards the things I actually want. Like all of my energy is going towards what I'm against. And what am I even for? Because I haven't even thought about that. I've been so focused on,
Yeah.
oh, what am I against, and protecting myself. So that just felt resonant and similar.
Yeah. And I've been talking a lot with my girlfriends and some of our teachers and philosophy people we talk to. And we've been talking a lot about mimetic conflict and how a lot of our conflict is like a result of mimesis and mirroring what the other person is doing. And there is the tendency to become like what we're focused on. Right. And so there is that element to it is like, if I'm so focused on how this group of people or this person is wrong, the more likely I am to start mimicking and modeling those same behaviors inside myself because we are a species that learns by mimicking one another. Like, I'm sure you've seen that with your son. Like, that's just the way that we are. And so it is important to know, even though I have that tendency myself, that like when I'm doing that and focusing on the people I think are wrong, I'm probably more likely to be acting like them the more I'm focusing on how wrong they are. And so we won't in this conversation go down the political aspect of that, but like I think that there's some truth to the more I focus on protecting myself against narcissistic kinds of people, the more likely I am to be behaving in that way myself. Yeah, which is a huge bummer.
Isn't it, Joe?
Yeah, it's a huge bummer. Huge bummer.
Yeah. Well, I can't not ask this question because I've been so excited to have it, but I am mindful of our time, and this will be our last big question before we go into rapid fire.
I'll try to be brief.
And I was gonna say, you modulate how deeply you want to go into this one because it is a deep one, if according to whatever time we have. But um, something I know we share is our background in high control religion, and
Yes.
I'm just profoundly interested for us to touch on, however in depth we can today, that neurocomplex to high control religion pipeline that I know that we're in, and why you think being neurocomplex may set us up for honestly being groomed for those types of groups and spaces.
I love this question. I think it could be multiple. I think it could be multiple things. I do think that we have the tendency to not pick up on like underlying motivations of people and to be really trusting, especially before like I almost feel like I don't know if this is your experience, but I feel like I had to manually learn the social things that everyone else seemed to know. And so like in some ways, I feel like my brain is just developing, like in understanding what's happening around me in terms of like social things that it seems like other people knew sooner. And so, like, I really had to try to learn about motivations and why people are being kind. And looking back at how I kind of got groomed into those environments, like I can see that obviously that person was being manipulative or they had ulterior motives or they were using me. But at the time, like I really trusted that I trusted what they said, not what their bodies were doing. And I think, yeah, I see you're like, yes. Like I really think so many of us who were taught to not listen to our body responses because we were told our body responses were wrong learned to trust what people said, but unfortunately, people are lying or not saying the truth. And I find, at least in my experience, I can read bodies and energy really well. And it's really confusing when the body and energy doesn't match the words. And so I've learned to feel for the dissonance between, or in the incongruence between the body and the words. But when I was young, I was like, oh, well, I'm wrong. So I'm going to believe what they're saying. And it turns out, like, actually, I deeply knew what my body was saying, but I had learned not to trust myself. And I think that severance from our listening to our body's wisdom because it was inconvenient to those around us. I mean, anyone for any reason who's disconnected from their body's wisdom due to trauma, neurodivergence, they're at risk of harm. Like people with high A scores are at a way greater risk of repeating those traumatic experiences later in life because they've been severed from their body's wisdom. And so, if we're chronically gaslit about our reality, told that you're not sensitive, you're just making a big deal out of nothing. Well, then there's a freeze. We're not listening. We're trusting what they're saying. I also think there's a belonging element that like it can be harder for us socially. And so if you go into a space where everyone has shared language that's really easy to use, then like that makes a lot of sense. Oh, the rules are explicit and clear on how to relate here. Great. I love to know the context for what's going on. And so I think it's all of those things. And I do think that some of the black and white rigid processing could have to do with that as well. They say that some people like to glamorize autism, that it's like we're better people because we just have pure hearts. But like really the justice sensitivity is that we strongly we don't want to be incongruent with our morals and with what our body is saying. But some of us have internalized that like, high control religion's the right way. And so that need to be congruent would be molded around that belief system that would then become highly rigid. And so I think that there's like, I think about my dad who's autistic and, really, really evangelical. And it's so rigid and he's so true to himself. But the things he has learned are true for safety are deeply harmful to other people. And so in some ways, I like see his goodness inside of what he's attempting to do, but he's become really like calcified around this belief system for his own safety. And I do think people who are autistic and severed from their own inner knowing are susceptible to that. I also don't think that everyone who is autistic is severed from their inner knowing or is wrong or bad. I just think just like anyone, our traits can lend themselves to a lot of beautiful things. And also, you know, I was I was pretty rigid around my beliefs whenever I was in a high control group. So those are some of my theories. I haven't studied it extensively or anything, but I think it tracks. What do you think?
I agree with everything you shared, especially because, I mean, you all heard at the beginning of the podcast the story of my own severance from my body that was very necessary because of the continued exposure to all my triggers. And it's like, how could I have possibly been connected to my body during that? I could not have.
Yeah.
And then people are swooping in and telling me exactly what I need to think and believe and whatever to be safe. And the other piece that feels resonant for me is that a lot of my experience, I felt so out of control and out of control of, how my body was responding, let's say in sensory overwhelm and sensory processing difficulties, all these things, that it almost feels like it gives you a semblance of controlling, so I think that is resonant as well for me, like giving me a sense of control for something that is out of control. Something that I saw Lindsay Macarith, I think that's maybe how you pronounce her last name, say is that I think maybe in her research she talks about how they've been found that like neurocomplex people do have maybe a deeper connection to spirituality, to the divine, just based on the way our brains are wired. And so I almost feel like that can kind of play into that as well, is like maybe the people who are autistic or neurocomplex in general, whatever form that neurocomplexity takes, maybe it really takes hold quite deeply because we already have that propensity there. And so,
I agree with that.
yeah, I think that that's another interesting thing to sort of consider.
I'm really curious. I don't know if this is your experience, but a lot of people I talk to talk about being more connected to spirit and to animals than to other people. And I think for me at least, like spirit was where I felt the most safe, the most at home, and deep compassion and empathy. But like I've heard it reported from people that they weren't experiencing my responses to them as being deeply compassionate. And because our tendency to think logically, and like to communicate logically, I think it can lend itself sometimes to like if you think about like spirit being light, air, more like Ayurveda Vata energy, like a little detached. And if we're also detached from our own bodies, if we're in that like more of a traumatized place with it, I could see high control being in that place. Like personally, in terms of like a trauma response, I see high control religion itself as a spiritual trauma, a collective spiritual trauma response. And so specifically a flight energy. So, like, if you think about it like a spiritual relational flight in a collective group of people, and then you have an autistic body who also is in a threat response of flight and having to flee into something spiritual to be safe, like, that's kind of a perfect match. I hope that's making sense, but I think collective groups of people are in certain collective trauma responses, and high control is like hyper, like there's hyper control, there's rigidity. And so anybody who resonates with that response could find themselves resonating with that group of people. And so I think if you just look at all of the different responses different collectives are having, it's like people who have a similar, we can call it vibration, but really nervous system response will find themselves matching with that group of people whose collective energy they resonate with, right? So maybe I'm getting too meta.
No, that I really appreciate that you brought that in, because I was resonating with what you were saying so hard. And I was like, yes, yes, yes. This is precisely why I wanted to have the conversation with you. So thank you for going there.
Yeah, I'm having so much fun.
Yeah, me too. I want to respect your time. So I would love to hear how people can learn more about you and work with you, Madison.
Yeah, so the time of you're airing this, I have my year-long program, The Fortress, is open. It's a monthly membership for a year, and then people can continue on. A lot of people from last year are like, I want to go month to month. So it's a year-long commitment, then month to month. And we do like monthly lessons on the nervous system, on things like shame, on creating conditions for safety. Like month one is called creating conditions. And so it's about establishing that baseline. And then by the end of the program, we're talking a little bit more about spirit, about living in your essence. And so we'll go on that journey from creating conditions. We'll do shame alchemy, and we do 2 group calls a month. And so the enrollment for that is open. And if anyone's like, you're interesting, I'd like to kind of microdose your work, I have that shame alchemy workshop I mentioned, and it's sliding scale. The links, so madisonmorrigan.com will guide you to all of them. But if you backslash fortress, you can learn more about the fortress there. And then I haven't recorded a podcast episode in a long time. I've been on a break, but I do have a podcast called Everything Belongs. I've been very much on social media as of late, on Instagram and TikTok under my name, Madison Morrigan. And I have a Substack, which is really just personal writing. And so I kind of write my way through my own process. Like I was saying, there's a lot going on in here. And so I write my own personal process in my Substack called Garden of Goodness. If anyone wants to read more of like memoir style writing, I try to keep it somewhat separate from my client work. But really, right now, the Fortress is the way that I would love to connect with people, because it's where I get to do this work really deeply. But if not, follow along on Instagram. I'm having a good time talking about farts and such there. Just because.
Absolutely. All right, wonderful. Well, I'm going to transition into rapid fire, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you'd like to say in closing that feels like it needs another moment to wrap up from our podcast today?
No, I really appreciate the space to be in this kind of relationship with you, where like I'm not like, I'm really just riffing on what's happening for me and not having to be overly in any specific role. And that feels really nice. It also feels, just to name it, feels slightly vulnerable because, as a true autistic person, I prefer to be in a role that is less just blasting all of my thoughts, because that can be quite a lot. And so I appreciate the space and just naming that it's also vulnerable to share in this way that's a little bit less like pre-planned and off the cuff. So I appreciate it. And I just love getting to be with you.
Thank you so much for naming that. And thank you for honoring me with your vulnerability.
Thank you.
What do you wish people knew about your experience as a neurodivergent person in the world?
I told an ex, put on my tombstone, like, but she cared so much. And I really can't tell. I really I don't know what I look like. I really don't know how people are perceiving me. Like, all of that is a complete mystery to me. And so I don't know if people aren't receiving me the way I want them to. but I like really want people to know that I care. And I know that sometimes I think I have a lot of sadness over the ways that people misinterpret like my care or have in the past. It brings up a lot of grief for me to not be received in my caring the way that I feel. And I think sometimes I overcompensate and then like I'm showing too much care. I'm like, oh God, what's the right amount of caring? I'm like, I just want to care an appropriate amount, but whatever would make you feel comfortable. And so I care, and also like I am sad for the ways that hasn't come across in the way that I intended to.
What is the last thing that truly inspired you?
Hmm. Oh my goodness. I'm like, oh, inspiration, what does that feel like? I don't know. I mean, this conversation has certainly been inspiring. I think I've gotten really excited about like decorating my house, and I've been really inspired about clothes and decorating and self-expression visually lately. And I've started doing functional patterns with a personal trainer once a week, and that has been kind of inspiring to see that my like what my body can do. Um, I'm gonna be thinking about that because I'm like, it will come to me tomorrow, I'm sure.
I love that. And I love what you've already named. All right, last one. What consistently brings you deep joy?
Morris is really bringing me deep joy lately. I've been letting him sleep in my bed, which was not a practice when he was a puppy. And he wakes up literally like in my arms, like curled up next to me, just like breathing, so cute. And he's kind of coming out of the really kind of honestly annoying puppy phase. Like, I'm just like, I love you, but you are so intense right now and it's stressing me out. And he's really mellowing out in this way that he's able to be a little bit more present, a little more settled. And I'm enjoying those like little moments where he's just like asleep or he'll put his head on my shoulder. And it's just like it kills me. And so I would say that.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for sharing. And I just want to say that at multiple points in this conversation, I got goosebumps. I felt tears in my eyes. And
Mm.
I just feel really honored for you to take your time and share your wisdom, your expertise with all of us. So thank you so much, Madison.
Thank you so much, Kim.